Hi and welcome to our online broadcast. Today we are continuing to plait together three great themes when we look at the subject of faith. The New Testament, the Old Testament, and us here today on this recording. Today we're looking at living life when you don't know where you're going, and to help us we're looking at the life and times of the person of Abraham. We're going to be reading in a moment from Hebrews chapter 11 verse 8, and I preach on these verses in one of our in-person services before Christmas. Some of you may remember, most of you won't, don't worry, my fragile ego will remain unaffected, but I did then and return to them today as we continue our series in Hebrews 11 by faith. And after looking at Abel, Enoch and Noah, we land today for three-part sessions on the life of Abraham. In a moment, I'm going to read to you our teaching text from Hebrews 11, but I'm also going to be spending quite a bit of time in Genesis chapter 12, where we read of the beginnings of this life of Abraham and the first 8 verses there. So when this video pauses in a moment, you may wish to flick to Genesis 12, read those verses. That'll be a very, very smart thing to do, and then press play again. Our theme, as I've mentioned today, is how to live in life when you don't know where you're going. And so if you are someone like me who's ever had to make a decision, think about what comes next, navigate some tricky terrain in life, then generally, if you're alive at all, well, I trust that today the Bible will speak to us. Hebrews 11, 8-10 says this: By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. That is the word of the Lord. If you've just read Genesis 12:2, which, like I said, it would be such a helpful thing to do, you'll realise, and as we go through this, you'll realise that Abraham is such a critically important person in a critically important story in the arc of the Old Testament. Because through this man, Abraham, God promises that all peoples on earth will be blessed. If you ask most people, I guess, who Abraham is, some wouldn't know, but to both Muslims, Jews, and of course Christians, that's over half the world's population, they would attribute him some level of direction or inspiration or teaching, and the other half of the world has been impacted by this man, Abraham. So, who was he? The Bible tells us in Genesis that God created humanity for perfect relationship, for harmony, for paradise. And it tells, of course, the story that humanity rejects God. And that rejection was caused by and culminated in sin, a lie, and horrific consequences. Our relationship with God breaks down. Our relationship with each other breaks down. And our relationship with our world breaks down. And in this tragic brokenness that led ultimately then to Noah and its flood, who David talked about him last week, and from there to a story and an account of the Tower of Babel, where humanity declared in Genesis 11 that, well, we want to be our God. We want to do our own thing. We're going to build a tower to get up to heaven ourselves. And the Bible tells us that God intervenes and humanity is scattered. And then it tells us and boils down to one particular tribe of people from Noah's line that leads through the generations to a man called Terah and his son Abram, who we know as Abraham. The Bible tells us that from that place, from a place called Ur of the Chaldeans, Abraham and his family left and journeyed towards Canaan. And so in all likelihood, Abraham was from this place called Ur, which lots of historians believe was a city on the coast in now southern Iraq. Bible tells us that Abraham, as part of his father Terah's household, leaves along with his wife Sarai or Sarah, his nephew Lot, and his father's household, and they head towards Canaan, the other end of the plain of the Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf, 750 miles in a straight line west. Of course, travel in those days would have been unexpected, dangerous, difficult, but eventually Sarai, Abraham and Lot reach Canaan, Genesis 12:5. And from that land, and as the story of the life of Abraham and his family untold, we see that through this man, blessing would come to the entire world everywhere. Not because of an invention that he'd done, but because of someone who would be born. The Gospel of Matthew opens with these words, "This is the beginnings of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham." And so we're going to spend 3 weeks on Abraham. We're looking at verse 8 to 10 in Genesis, in Hebrews 11 today. And so we're going to use that and Genesis 12 as to give us some thoughts on this part of his life story. Hebrews tells us that by faith, Abraham, when told to go, went. If you've noticed anything in Hebrews 11 so far, you'll have become aware that these people mentioned are commended for something they didn't see or perceive with their eyes or senses. They're praised for what they don't know, they didn't hear, they don't understand, they didn't see, and yet even though they didn't have the natural facts that would help them live their lives, they lived them in such ways by faith. By faith, Abraham went where he did not know and obeyed even though he didn't know where he was going. In Genesis 12, it says, "The Lord had said to Abraham, go." I find it interesting that the first thing we're told God told Abraham is the last thing Jesus tells his disciples, go. This God is a God of movement, of momentum, of change. He's not static. He creates, he liberates, he saves, he sends, he speaks, he loves. Go from your country, your people, your father's household to the land I will show you, and I will bless you. Hebrews 11 tells us that Abraham believed and obeyed and went even though he did not know the way. Why would you do that? Why on earth would you do that? In Genesis 12, God promises him something extraordinary. God promised him that he'd change him from a person to a family. God promised him blessing. God promised him legacy. God promised him fruitfulness. God promised him promotion from others. God promised him protection from others. God promised him abundance. All peoples will be blessed. And so God promised him something extraordinary, and Abraham listened and believed, and so he went. Because to Abraham, the promises of God are worth more than ... Fill in the blank for that. For Abraham, the promises of God were worth more than settling, than familiarity, than childlessness. The promises of God were worth more. And so he went. Genesis tells us that he was 75 years old when he set off, and he took people with him. You're never too old to step forward in the purpose of God. And as you do so, you can bring people along with you. I think it's interesting that in Genesis 12, Genesis seems to attribute Abraham's desire to leave Ur in the Chaldeans to Terah, his father. You read of it in the previous chapter. We're not told if Terah knew about the promise of God to Abraham. We're not told if God had brought Terah in on the act. We just know that he took Abraham from Ur and they headed to Canaan. But it also tells us that Terah and the family stopped and settled in a place halfway between, a place called Haran. I wonder if you think it's possible that you know that you are integral to the purposes of God being released and find fulfillment in the lives of others, particularly in the lives of your children. That's what Terah did. You can do that. I'm so glad that my parents did that for me and my siblings. My wife's parents did that for her and her sibling. They stepped up, they were consistent, they loved this God, they loved his church, and did that as we grew until we ourselves knew we had to step forward into God's plans too. See, the movement in our lives, the decisions we make, the ceilings we break through can become the floor on which the future stands. That's what Terah did. He took Abraham in order to go towards the promised land. But also, there's a critical thing that is also the case, that we can miss the promises of God because we choose to settle for something less than he has in store. Terah, it says, was intent on going to Canaan, but he settled in Haran. We're told there in Genesis 11 that he had lost a son, the most heartbreaking thing a parent can go through. And so whether it was grief or contentment or pleasure or desire, we don't know. Terah didn't go all the way. We know it's harder when we get older, when we've been around for some time. Time was that we were the young ones, the trailblazers, the trendsetters. We had the energy. But somehow along the line, sometimes people decide to settle just where you are and not travel on with the future. You might have done your bit and so now it's all right to settle. I see it in every church I'm a part of. Every church I come in contact with, there is a genuine generational challenge that I think the enemy of our souls wants to wreak havoc with. And it happens sometimes when some of our older people decide, I don't want to carry on with the future, and are tempted to settle and split in the family of God. Can I humbly suggest that you resist that temptation? That you run hard for all that God has for you until he takes us home. Run hard for the future. Seek the young. Reach the promised land of God, however you are, however you do it. Keep learning, keep loving, keep growing, keep sharing your faith. Terah settled. But Abraham believed God and had to leave that place of settling. He had to leave that place of comfort because the promises of God are worth more than ... Fill in the blanks. What are they for you? The promises of God are worth more than. What will you put there? Are they worth more than your career? Has God spoken to you? Has God revealed something to you? Has God encouraged you, directed you, inspired you, called you, challenged you? But maybe that was a long time ago. What is more important? The promises of God are worth more than my money, my ego, my desire to settle, my time, my fear. Abraham went, even though he did not know where he was going. I wonder if God has ever put anything in your heart, any latent memory, any old promise. I wonder if he's ever mentioned anything to you, given you the heads up on something, encouraged you in a certain way. Notice as we read this account, we know nothing, absolutely nothing about the manner by which God spoke to Abraham, the personal, specific manner in which God communicated with Abraham, apart from the fact that it says in Genesis 12, the Lord had said. God, this God is a speaking God. What's he said? At the beginning of this year, the Holy Spirit spoke to us as church leaders here. He said that this year he wanted to do exceedingly more in us, through us. That he wanted us to become dependent on him because he had come to stretch us, not to break us, but to stretch us. And we have taken little steps of faith by faith that's led to other moments where faith steps are required. We don't know where we're going, but God has spoken something to us and his promises are worth more than where we're currently at. I wonder about us now. Because Abraham went, because God's promises are worth more. If point number one of this account is that Abraham went because God's promises are worth more, point number two to help us in this journey, I guess, is that Abraham lived lightly in the land. There's a little bit of alliteration for you. Abraham lived lightly in the land. He held the things of this world lightly as he navigated through life. Hebrews 11 tells us that Abraham and his children were living in tents, that he made his home in the land that God had promised him, like a stranger in a foreign country, because, he says, Abraham, was looking for somewhere to live that could only have been provided by God. A city with foundations whose architect and builder is God. And he did all of that by faith. He couldn't see it, but he believed it. I love that thought. Abraham is leading his family and around living through in tents. Sarah might be saying, can we just put some roots down now? And he says, no, I can't, because we're not living in the city yet. What city? Well, God invited us here, so we live in a place he provides. We're going to live in something only God could have provided. And so, my friends, my dear friends, following Jesus is an invitation to a life that you could never have built on your own. Following Jesus is an invitation to live a life only God could build. A city whose architect, the designer of it, and builder, the executor of it, is God. And Genesis 12 says that Abraham travelled through the land as far as the site of the great tree of Moreh at Shechem. It's not like Lord of the Rings here now. The great tree of Moreh. Genesis 12 says that he was living amongst people in the land. But Abraham was living with them, but not as them. He had got there because God had told him to go. Because the promises of God were enough to go on the adventure. And when he got there, when he moved around there, living like a stranger there, familiar but keeping a distance, aware but not settling down, holding lightly his own life in the promises of God. Well, what happens? Genesis 12 says, God appears to him. So here we go. If you're a follower of Jesus, when you obey him, when you journey in your life with him, believing in his promises, trusting him to fulfill them so that they're worth more than fill in the blanks, you end up sort of living in a space of partial fulfillment, knowing that I'm not quite yet there, but there's more to come. It's this weird unsettling time. You're sort of there, but not there. You've made certain steps in life, but where else is there to go? It's all a bit different. And the temptation is, and we'll see it in Abraham's life, in his ridiculous mistakes, the temptation is that you start making stupid decisions, having stupid decisions, trying to bring back lordship to your life rather than Christ's, trying to not live out the promises of God, holding things a bit too tightly. Abraham held things lightly, and God appeared. Here's the point. When you follow Christ and trust him with the actual bits of your life, where you live, what you'll do, what your job is, what you spend your money in, who your friends are, who you go to bed with, if you actually say, you are the Lord of me, that your promises of salvation and transformation and presence are worth more than all of this stuff, guess what, my friends? The Lord appears to you. You might think right now I've gone slightly mad, but I haven't. When you get closer and closer to him and his will, you often realize that he is closer and closer to you. And the revelation of him that you thought you knew gets bigger. He is the life. Seek him and you'll find him. And Abraham leaves everything to go to the place God had told him. And as he's there, the Lord appears to him and promises them that all of this land will belong to him and his family, that this is the reality of his future. My friends, if you want to know God, do what he last told you to do. If you want to experience him or believe that what he says he means and what he tells you will happen, if you want God, believe. It is a pretty big deal that on our journeys through life, for my part at least, through marriage and family and job and relationships, through the ordinary stuff, God's in it somehow and appears through it somehow to help determine my next steps, to order my ways, to fulfill his plan in my life. God is the gospel. He's on it in my life. And Abraham models to us in this season the right response to God's invitation. Believe that his promises are worth more than fill in the blank. Hold lightly the things of this world because there's a life available to you that can only be lived if God builds it. And every time you gain a greater revelation of God, like Abraham did, stop, build something, and worship. Genesis 12, verse 7. I can look back over my life at some of the key moments in pain or triumph, the key moments of understanding something about God's love, his provision, his protection, his favour. And I've noticed that sometimes wisely I built my life on those things. Whether it's the career choice, the next relationship choice, the house move, the prayer bit. When God shows up and reveals something to you, my friends, you can build on that. When you build on it, worship him. Worship is the submission of all of our nature to God, William Temple says. And it's the laying down of everything. That you recognize, God, you've given me this. You've supplied me this. You've brought me here. And it's all yours, and all I have is yours, and you're all I want. His promises must be bigger, greater than. Hold lightly the things of this world, because God's offering you a life that only he can build. And when he shows up in it, well, build something and worship him. You'd think Abraham is this sort of legend, this perfect, absolute legend. And there we are, there's the end of the story. That's how to navigate life when you don't know where you're going. But he really isn't, actually, and neither of any of us. He's about to do some really stupid things. And, well, so do we. I mean, really, really, really stupid things. I've said stupid things, done stupid things, acted in stupid ways. I've had to apologize more often than not. I've had to course correct in my life again and again. We're just a bit stupid. And yet, Abraham goes on, it says in Genesis 12, that he goes on and pitches his tent between two great cities, between Bethel and Ai. Bethel literally means the house of God, and Ai means, well, a big pile of stuff. And in that in-between bit, between these two places, it tells us again he builds an altar and calls on the name of the Lord. See, Abraham has no idea where he's going, says Hebrews. But God spoke to him, and so he went. He left his father's stuff, he left his old life, he left and went because the promises were worth more, fill in the blanks. And he lived his life lightly in the land. And when God shows up, he builds upon it and lays it all down again. But in the journey, he ends up finding himself between the house of God, the sanctuary space of always being in God's presence, always and forever, where we just, oh yes. And all the stuff, the bills, the school run, the annoying work colleague, that health condition you might have become aware of, all the stuff of life, these in-between bits. But in that place of in-between, it says he builds an altar and he prays. My friends, that's how to live when you don't know where you're going. By faith. That's how you live when you don't know where you're going. By holding on to the promises of God and making them worth more to you than fill in the blanks. And so, are you doing that? Are you holding everything in this world lightly because you want to live in such a way that only God can build? Have you built your life on God's revelations to you, and have you worshipped him, laying everything down? And when you're caught between the mountaintop experience and the valley experience, the brilliant moments and the stuff of life, do you stop? Do you recalibrate your vision towards the Lord who brought you safe this far and worship him and call on him for what happens next? It is a great lesson to be learned. How to live a life when you don't know where you're going. By